The wind howled like a hungry wolf around the small, dusty town of Redemption. Most folks huddled by their fires, but a flickering lamp burned late in the window of the doctor's office. Inside, Dr. Eli, a man etched with the hardships of the frontier, sighed as he cleaned his instruments. His hands, though calloused, moved with a practiced grace, a testament to years spent mending broken bones and battling sickness in this unforgiving land. He wasn't a young man anymore. The lines around his eyes deepened with each passing year, each harsh winter, each life he couldn't save. He yearned for a quieter life, a life free from the constant fear that gnawed at him. Folks respected Dr. Eli. They came to him with their ailments, their injuries, their hopes, and their fears. He was the only doctor for miles, a beacon of healing in a world of pain. But they didn't know the full story. They didn't know the secret that weighed heavily on his conscience. He glanced at the trapdoor hidden beneath a loose rug in his office. It led to a root cellar, converted into a makeshift operating room. It wasn't for the townsfolk. It was for a different kind of patient, a clientele he kept hidden from the light of day. Men with shadowed eyes, scarred faces, and hands stained with sin. Outlaws, criminals. He treated them, patched them up, and sent them back into the wilderness. In return, they offered him a twisted form of protection. They kept the really bad men away. The claim jumpers, the cattle rustlers, the killers who preyed on the weak. It was a devil's bargain, a compromise he made to survive. He hated it. The guilt ate at him, a slow, agonizing poison. He dreamed of escaping, of leaving Redemption and finding a place where he could practice medicine without looking over his shoulder. But he was trapped by his past, trapped by his fear, trapped by the very men he was trying to help. Little did he know, his fragile peace was about to be shattered. The storm was coming, and it wore a badge. The arrangement had started small, a favor here, a discreet patching up there. A wounded bank robber, desperate and bleeding, begging for help at his back door in the dead of night. Eli, driven by his oath to heal, had reluctantly agreed. He'd removed the bullet, stitched the wound, and sent the man on his way, no questions asked. But word spread like wildfire through the criminal underworld. Soon, more outlaws came, each with a tale of woe and a bullet wound to match. Eli realized he was walking a dangerous tightrope. One wrong move, one loose tongue, and his reputation, his life, would be forfeit. Then came the offer of protection. A gruff, imposing figure named Big Joe came to him, a notorious gang leader known for his ruthlessness. Joe proposed a deal. Eli would treat his men, and in return, Joe would ensure no other unsavory characters bothered him or the town. It was a tempting proposition. Redemption was a small town, vulnerable to all sorts of dangers. Eli had seen good people suffer, seen their homes raided, their livelihoods destroyed. The protection, however morally questionable, offered a sense of security. So he agreed. The root cellar became his secret clinic, a place where he wrestled with his conscience while tending to bullet wounds and knife gashes. He told himself he was doing it for the greater good, that the protection he provided outweighed the sin of aiding criminals. But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. The blood money paid for new medical supplies kept the roof over his head and filled his pantry, but also stained his soul. He found himself increasingly isolated, unable to confide in anyone, burdened by the weight of his secret. He saw the fear in the eyes of the townsfolk, the way they flinched when strangers rode into town. He knew, in his heart, that his deal with the devil was slowly poisoning Redemption. He just didn't know how to break free. The night was darker than usual, even for Redemption. A frantic pounding on the back door jolted Eli from a fitful sleep. He grabbed his shotgun, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew who it was before he even opened the door. 3 men, cloaked in shadows, half dragging, half carrying a fourth. All of them were bleeding, some worse than others. The stench of gunpowder and sweat filled the air. "Doc," one of them rasped, "we need your help. Bad." Eli recognized the speaker as Fingers Frankie, a low-level thug from Big Joe's gang, known for his quick hands and even quicker temper. He glanced at the injured man, who was unconscious and bleeding heavily from a gunshot wound to the shoulder. "What happened?" Eli asked, his voice tight. "Stagecoach," Frankie replied, spitting on the ground. "Went south. Didn't get what we were expecting." Ili hesitative. He was already teetering on the edge of a moral abyss, and this felt like a plunge into the depths. Stagecoach robbery was a serious offense, even in this lawless territory. Treating these men would make him an accomplice. "We'll pay double," Frankie offered, his eyes glinting in the darkness. "Joe said to tell you, we're good for it." Eli knew he couldn't refuse. Not without risking the wrath of Big Joe. And he couldn't let a man die on his doorstep, not even a criminal. "Get him inside," he said, his voice resigned. As he led them to the root cellar, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that this was a turning point. The stakes were higher now, the danger more palpable. He was no longer just treating wounded outlaws. He was embroiled in their crimes. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that this situation was about to spiral out of control. This time, the devil's bargain was demanding a steeper price. The storm wasn't just coming. It was here. Meanwhile, miles away, Sheriff Brody surveyed the wreckage of the stagecoach. The scene was chaotic. The strong box lay open and empty. The horses were scattered, and a few townsfolk were tending to the injured passengers. Brody, a tall, imposing figure with a steely gaze, knelt beside a wounded woman, offering her a comforting word. He wasn't a man to be trifled with. He was known for his unwavering commitment to justice and his relentless pursuit of criminals. He had cleaned up several towns before arriving in Redemption, and he had no intention of letting this one fall into the hands of outlaws. "Anything, Sheriff?" a young deputy asked, approaching the scene. Brody stood up, his jaw tight. "They got away clean, but they left a trail of blood." He pointed to a series of crimson droplets leading away from the overturned stagecoach. "Looks like at least one of them is hurt bad." "Think they'll head to Doc Eli?" the deputy asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Brody's eyes narrowed. He'd heard whispers about Doc Eli and his unusual clientele. He dismissed them as rumors, but now, looking at the blood trail, he couldn't help but wonder. "Could be," he said slowly. "Eli's the only doctor for miles. But I find it hard to believe a man of medicine would consort with criminals." "People do strange things when they're desperate, Sheriff," the deputy replied, his gaze unwavering. Brody sighed. He knew the truth in those words. He'd seen good men driven to desperate measures by circumstance. "We'll follow the trail," he said, his voice firm. "And if it leads to Doc Eli, we'll find out what's really going on in that root cellar of his." He remounted his horse, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The hunt had begun, and Redemption was about to learn just how far Sheriff Brody was willing to go to uphold the law. The sun beat down mercilessly as Sheriff Brody and his deputy followed the blood trail. It led them through rocky terrain and dense thickets, the landscape growing increasingly desolate. Brody's resolve, however, remained unshaken. He was a man who didn't give up easily. They were ambushed just outside of town. 3 figures emerged from behind a cluster of rocks, guns blazing. Brody reacted swiftly, drawing his own weapon and returning fire. His deputy, caught off guard, took a bullet to the leg and fell to the ground. Brody fought fiercely, taking down one of the attackers with a well-aimed shot. But he was outnumbered. Another bullet grazed his side, and a third ripped through his shoulder, sending a searing pain through his body. He stumbled, his vision blurring. The remaining outlaws, seeing their advantage, closed in. Brody knew he was in trouble. He managed to take cover behind a large boulder, but he was losing blood fast. He needed help, and he needed it now. His deputy, despite his injury, managed to fire a few shots, driving the outlaws back momentarily. "Get out of here, son," Brody yelled, his voice strained. "Get help." The deputy hesitated, but Brody's stern gaze left no room for argument. He knew Brody was right. He had to get to town and bring back reinforcements. "I'll be back, Sheriff," he shouted, before limping away as fast as his wounded leg would allow. Brody was alone now, wounded and vulnerable. He knew the outlaws would be back. He closed his eyes for a moment, bracing himself for the inevitable. But then, He remembered Doc Eli. He'd heard the rumors, but he also knew that Eli was a doctor. And right now, he was his only hope. He just hoped the rumors weren't true. He just hoped Doc Eli would help a dying sheriff. Gathering his remaining strength, Brody started crawling toward redemption, toward the only man who could save his life, and perhaps condemn his soul. Eli was hunched over the outlaw, Frankie stitching a deep gash on his arm, when another frantic pounding echoed through his small house. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat. It was the deputy, young, scared, and desperate. The deputy burst through the door, his face pale and streaked with sweat. "Doc, sheriff's been shot. Bad. We need your help." Eli stared at him, his mind racing. This was it, the moment he had dreaded. The moment his carefully constructed facade would crumble. He glanced at Frankie, who was watching the scene with narrowed eyes. The other outlaws stirred, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. "Can't you see I'm busy?" Eli said, his voice trembling slightly. He needed to buy time to think. "Sheriff's gonna die if you don't help him, Doc," the deputy pleaded. "He needs you." Eli looked from the deputy to Frankie, then back again. He was caught between two worlds, between the law and the outlaws, between his conscience and his fear. He knew what he had to do. He was a doctor, first and foremost. He had sworn an oath to heal. "Bring him in," Eli said, his voice barely a whisper. Frankie's eyes flashed with anger. "What about us, Doc? You gonna leave us bleeding while you tend to the law?" "He's hurt worse than you are," Eli replied, trying to sound firm. "I'll get to you as soon as I can." He knew it was a lie. He couldn't risk the outlaws finding out about the sheriff. He had to hide him. He directed the deputy to a small, forgotten storage room behind the kitchen, a space he hadn't used in years. It was cramped and dusty, but it would have to do. "Put him in here," Eli instructed, "and keep quiet." As the deputy struggled to move the wounded sheriff, Eli knew he was walking on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one suspicious glance, and everything would fall apart. He was about to betray the very men who had sworn to protect him. But he had no choice. He had to save the sheriff, even if it meant risking his own life. Redemption, it seemed, was about to demand its due. Eli plastered a forced smile on his face and returned to the root cellar, where the outlaws were growing increasingly restless. "Sorry about that," he said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Just a neighbor with a sick child." Frankie raised a skeptical eyebrow. "A sick child? Sounds like you were awfully eager to help." "It's what I do," Eli replied, his voice tight. "I'm a doctor." He finished stitching Frankie's arm, then turned his attention to the other wounded outlaws. But his mind was elsewhere. He was constantly listening for any sound from the storage room, any indication that the sheriff was still alive. Hours passed. The outlaws, fueled by whiskey and paranoia, grew increasingly suspicious. They noticed Eli's nervous demeanor, the way he kept glancing toward the kitchen. They whispered amongst themselves, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. "He's hiding something," one of them muttered, a burly man with a scarred face. "I can feel it." Frankie, the most hot-headed of the group, decided to take matters into his own hands. "I'm going to take a look around," he announced, standing up. "Make sure everything's on the up and up." Eli's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. He had to stop Frankie, but he couldn't be too obvious. "There's no need for that," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I assure you, everything is fine." Frankie ignored him. He checked the bedrooms, the pantry, even the outhouse, his suspicion growing with each passing moment. Eli followed close behind, his shotgun heavy in his hands, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Finally, Frankie reached the kitchen. He paused, his gaze fixed on the door to the storage room. "What's this?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "Just a storage room," Eli replied, trying to sound casual. "Nothing in there but old junk." Frankie smirked. "Let's take a look, shall we?" He reached for the doorknob. Eli knew he couldn't let him open that door. He had to do something, anything, to stop him. "Don't," he blurted out, his voice cracking. Frankie stopped, his eyes narrowing. "Why not, Doc? Where are you hiding?" Eli knew he couldn't lie anymore. The jig was up. "There's someone in there," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Who?" Frankie demanded, his hand tightening on the doorknob. Eli took a deep breath. "It's Sheriff Brody," he said, his voice resigned. "He's wounded. The deputy brought him here." Frankie's eyes widened in disbelief. Then a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "The sheriff? Well, well, well. Looks like you've been a busy little bee. Document." He threw open the door, revealing the small, cramped storage room. Sheriff Brody lay on the floor, pale and weak, but his eyes were open, and his hand was resting on the handle of his pistol. "Well, Sheriff," Frankie said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What a surprise. Looks like Doc Eli here's been playing both sides." Brody glared at Frankie, his jaw tight. "Don't involve him in this," he said, his voice raspy. "He just helped me." Frankie laughed. "Oh, he's involved now, Sheriff. He's very involved." He turned to Eli, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "You made a big mistake, Document. A very big mistake." The uneasy truce was over. The game had changed, and Dr. Eli was about to pay the price. Frankie leveled his pistol at the sheriff. "Say your prayers, lawman," he sneered. Eli stepped forward, placing himself between Frankie and Brody. "Don't do this, Frankie," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "He's in no condition to fight." "Get out of the way, Doc," Frankie warned, his eyes flashing with anger. "This ain't your fight." "It is now," Eli replied, his grip tightening on his shotgun. He knew he was making a choice that would forever alter the course of his life. He could no longer stand idly by while these men terrorized the town, while they used him for their own selfish purposes. He had to take a stand. "You're making a mistake, Doc," Frankie said, his voice dangerously low. "You think Big Joe's going to be happy about this." "I don't care about Big Joe," Eli retorted. "I'm done with all of you. I'm done living in fear." The other outlaws, sensing the shift in power, began to stir. Some sided with Frankie, others hesitated, unsure of what to do. The room was thick with tension, the air crackling with the potential for violence. "You're protecting a lawman, Doc," one of the outlaws said, his voice filled with disbelief. "After everything we've done for you." "You haven't done anything for me," Eli replied. "You've used me. You've exploited me. And I'm not going to let you do it anymore." Frankie's face twisted with rage. "Fine, Doc," he spat. "If that's the way you want it, then that's the way it's going to be." He raised his pistol, aiming it at Eli's chest. "Looks like you're going to be needing a doctor yourself." Eli braced himself, his finger tightening on the trigger of his shotgun. He knew he was outmatched, outgunned, but he was ready to fight. He was ready to die, if necessary. He was ready to finally be free. He had made his choice, and he would stand by it, no matter the cost. The storm had arrived, and it was time to face it head-on. The gunshot was deafening. Eli flinched, but kept his shotgun trained on Frankie. He hadn't fired. Brody, despite his weakened state, had managed to draw his pistol and shoot first. Frankie crumpled to the ground, clutching his chest. Chaos erupted. The other outlaws, panicked and enraged, opened fire. Eli ducked behind a table, bullets whizzing past his head. He returned fire, his shotgun blasting a hole in the wall. He wasn't a gunslinger, but he knew how to handle a weapon. He'd learned to survive in this unforgiving land. He used his knowledge of the house to his advantage, moving from room to room, using furniture as cover. He knew the layout of every room, every hallway, every hiding place. The outlaws, weakened by their wounds and disoriented by the sudden turn of events, were at a disadvantage. He remembered the layout of the root cellar, the shelves he'd built to store supplies, the weak points in the floorboards. He knew where they'd be most vulnerable. One outlaw, a hulking brute with a scar across his face, charged into the kitchen, firing wildly. Eli waited until he was close, then kicked out the legs of a nearby table, sending the outlaw sprawling. Before he could recover, Eli smashed a heavy, cast-iron skillet over his head, knocking him unconscious. Another outlaw tried to sneak up on him from behind, but Eli heard him coming. He spun around, firing his shotgun point blank. The outlaw staggered backward, clutching his stomach, then collapsed to the floor. The remaining outlaws, realizing they were outmatched, tried to flee, but Eli wouldn't let them escape. He chased them through the house, his shotgun roaring, his determination fueled by years of guilt and regret. He was no longer just a doctor. He was a force of nature, a man driven to the edge, fighting for his life and for the soul of redemption. The line he had crossed was now burned to ash behind him. There was only one way forward, and it was through the fire. The last outlaw, a wiry man with a shifty gaze, made a desperate attempt to escape through the back door. Eli cornered him in the yard, his shotgun leveled. The outlaw raised his hands in surrender. "Don't shoot, Doc. Please. I didn't want any of this." Eli hesitated. He wasn't a killer. He was a healer. But he couldn't let this man go free. He knew he would only cause more trouble, more pain. "Drop your weapon," Eli said, his voice firm. The outlaw slowly lowered his pistol to the ground. Eli approached him cautiously, his eyes never leaving his face. He disarmed the outlaw, then tied his hands behind his back. With the fighting over, an eerie silence descended upon the house. Eli surveyed the scene, his heart heavy. The house was a mess, riddled with bullet holes and splattered with blood. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and death. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. He returned to the storage room, where Sheriff Brody was lying, still conscious but barely clinging to life. "It's over," Eli said, his voice hoarse. "They're all taken care of." Brody managed a weak smile. "Thanks, Doc," he whispered. "You saved my life." "You saved mine too, Sheriff," Eli replied, in more ways than one. Just then, the sound of horses' hooves echoed in the distance. It was the deputy, returning with reinforcements. Eli knew his life was about to change forever. He had broken his deal with the outlaws, defended the sheriff, and fought for what he believed was right. But he still had to face the consequences of his actions. And he knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. Redemption, it seemed, was a long way off. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The fire had burned away the darkness, and a new dawn was breaking. The deputy and his posse arrived, their faces grim. They quickly secured the remaining outlaw and began tending to the wounded. The scene was one of controlled chaos, a stark contrast to the frantic violence that had just unfolded. Eli watched as they carefully carried Sheriff Brody outside, placing him on a makeshift stretcher. He knew that Brody needed immediate medical attention that he could provide. But he also knew that he was no longer trusted, that his reputation was tarnished beyond repair. As the deputy approached him, Eli braced himself for the inevitable arrest. He was ready to face the consequences of his actions. He knew he had broken the law, and he was prepared to pay the price. But the deputy didn't arrest him. Instead, he offered him a weary smile. "Thanks, Doc," he said. "You did good." Eli was taken aback. He had expected anger, resentment, perhaps even violence. But the deputy's words were filled with gratitude. "The sheriff told us what happened," the deputy continued. "He said you saved his life. He said you fought like a lion." Eli didn't know what to say. He was overwhelmed with emotion. He had expected condemnation, but instead, he was being praised. "We need you to tend to the sheriff, Doc," the deputy said. "He's lost a lot of blood. We need to get him back to town, but he won't make it without your help." Eli nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and gratitude. He grabbed his medical bag and rushed to Brody's side. He examined the sheriff's wounds, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. He knew what he had to do to keep him alive. "We need to get him to the clinic," Eli said, his voice firm. "I'll need clean bandages, sutures, and plenty of water." The deputy nodded and relayed the instructions to the posse. As they prepared to transport the sheriff, Eli couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could still redeem himself. Perhaps he could still find a way to make amends for his past mistakes. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was no longer alone. He had the respect of the community, the gratitude of the sheriff, and the unwavering support of the deputy. And that, he realized, was more than he could have ever hoped for. The first steps on the road to redemption had been taken. Back at his clinic, Eli worked tirelessly, his brow furrowed with concentration. He cleaned and stitched Brody's wounds, his skilled hands moving with a steady confidence. He knew that Brody's life hung in the balance, and he was determined to do everything he could to save him. As he worked, Eli couldn't help but notice the sheriff's watchful gaze. Brody was weak, but his eyes were sharp and observant. He saw the exhaustion in Eli's face, the tremor in his hands, the weight of guilt that still burdened his soul. Finally, after hours of painstaking work, Eli finished bandaging the sheriff's wounds. "You're going to be all right, Sheriff," he said, his voice filled with relief. "But you need to rest, and you need to tell me everything." Brody nodded slowly. "I know you've been helping outlaws, Doc," he said, his voice raspy. "I saw the way they looked at you. I heard the whispers in town." Eli saw it. He knew this moment was coming. He had hoped to avoid it, but he knew that he couldn't hide the truth forever. "It started small," Eli said, his voice filled with regret. "A favor here, a patching up there. Before I knew it, I was in too deep. I was trapped." "Why, Doc?" Brody asked, his eyes filled with genuine curiosity. "Why would you risk everything to help criminals?" Eli hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain his actions, how to convey the fear and desperation that had driven him to make such a terrible choice. "I was scared, Sheriff," Eli said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was afraid of what would happen to me, to this town, if I didn't cooperate. I thought I was protecting people, but I was wrong. I was only making things worse." Brody nodded slowly. He understood fear. He had seen it in the eyes of countless victims, in the faces of desperate men. But he also knew that fear was no excuse for breaking the law. "You did a good thing today, Doc," Brody said, his voice firm. "You saved my life, and you helped bring down a gang of dangerous criminals. But you still have to answer for your past actions." The journey to true redemption was still ongoing. The sheriff's survival and his acknowledgement were just a beginning. The next morning, Brody was stronger, but still confined to bed. Eli brought him a cup of coffee and a plate of food, his movements cautious, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Thank you, Doc," Brody said, taking a sip of the coffee. "This is good." He paused, his gaze fixed on Eli. "Tell me about Big Joe." Eli saw it. He knew he couldn't avoid this conversation. "He runs the biggest gang in the territory," Eli said. "He's ruthless, violent, and he has a lot of influence." "And he was protecting you?" Brody asked. Eli nodded. "He kept the other criminals away. The claim jumpers, the cattle rustlers, the killers. He made sure they didn't bother me, or the town." "And in return, you treated his men?" Brody pressed. "Yes," Eli admitted. "I patched them up, I set their bones, I did whatever I could to keep them alive." Brody was silent for a moment, his eyes narrowed in thought. "Did you ever treat anyone who was innocent?" he asked. "Anyone who was hurt by Big Joe's gang?" Eli's heart sank. He knew where this was going. "No," he said, his voice barely audible. "I never had the chance." Brody nodded slowly. "That's what I thought," he said. "You were helping the very men who were terrorizing this town. You were complicit in their crimes." Eli didn't argue. He knew Brody was right. He had made a terrible mistake, a mistake that had cost him his reputation, his peace of mind, and perhaps even his soul. "I know I have to pay for what I've done, Sheriff," Eli said, his voice filled with remorse. "I'm ready to face the consequences." Brody looked at him for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and disappointment. "I believe you, Doc," he said finally. "I believe you regret your actions, and I believe you're a good man at heart." "But," Eli prompted, sensing that there was more to come. Brody sighed. "But the law is the law, document, and you broke it. I can't just ignore what you've done." The weight of redemption was about to be felt in full. Brody listened patiently, his gaze unwavering. He absorbed every detail, every nuance, every flicker of emotion in Eli's voice. He was a good judge of character, and he believed that Eli was telling the truth. When Eli finished, a long silence hung in the air. Brody finally broke it. "Thank you, Doc," he said, his voice sincere. "That took courage." "What happens now, Sheriff?" Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Brody stood up, his movements still slow and deliberate, but his gaze was firm. "Now," he said, "we go to town. We talk to the judge, and we let justice take its course." As they rode into redemption, Eli couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The townsfolk lined the streets, their faces a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and resentment. He knew that many of them would never forgive him for what he had done. The trial was swift and decisive. Eli pleaded guilty to the charges against him, but Brody testified on his behalf, painting a picture of a man driven by fear, but ultimately redeemed by his courage and his compassion. The judge, a stern but fair man, listened intently to the testimony. He considered all the evidence, weighed all the arguments, and finally rendered his verdict. "Dr. Eli," he said, his voice booming through the courtroom, "you have committed serious crimes. You have broken the law, but you have also shown remorse, and you have demonstrated a willingness to make amends. Therefore," the judge continued, "I sentence you to 5 years of community service. You will continue to practice medicine and redemption, providing care to those who need it most. You will also be required to assist the sheriff in maintaining law and order, and you will be under strict supervision for the duration of your sentence." Eli was stunned. He had expected a prison sentence, perhaps even a death sentence, but instead, he was being given a second chance, a chance to prove himself, a chance to make amends, a chance to finally earn the redemption he so desperately craved. The journey was far from over, but a true path to redemption had finally revealed itself. The judge's verdict was met with a mixture of relief and resentment in the courtroom. Some of the townsfolk cheered, grateful for the second chance Eli had been given. Others muttered their disapproval, convinced that he had gotten off too easy. As Eli left the courtroom, he was met by Sheriff Brody, who offered him a firm handshake. "It's not going to be easy, Doc," Brody said. "You're going to have to earn their trust, but I believe you can do it." "Thank you, Sheriff," Eli replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "I won't let you down." And so, Dr. Eli began his community service. He continued to practice medicine, tending to the sick and injured, regardless of their social standing or their past deeds. He also assisted the sheriff in maintaining law and order, using his knowledge of the criminal underworld to help bring down other outlaws and protect the town. Slowly but surely, Eli began to earn the trust of the townsfolk. They saw his dedication, his compassion, and his unwavering commitment to serving the community. They realized that he was a changed man, a man who had learned from his mistakes and was determined to make amends. Years passed. Redemption slowly transformed from a lawless frontier town into a peaceful and prosperous community. And Dr. Eli became a respected and beloved figure, a symbol of hope and redemption. One day, as Eli was tending to a sick child, Sheriff Brody came to visit him. "I'm leaving, Doc," Brody said, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and satisfaction. "Leaving?" Eli asked, his heart sinking. "Where are you going?" "I've done my job here," Brody replied. "Redemption is safe now. It's time for me to move on, to find another town that needs my help." "But what about me?" Eli asked. "What will I do without you?" Brody smiled. "You'll be fine, Doc," he said. "You're a good man. You've earned the respect of this town, and you've finally found your own redemption." He extended his hand. "Goodbye, Doc," he said, "and thank you." Eli shook his hand, his heart filled with gratitude and admiration. "Goodbye, Sheriff," he said, "and thank you for giving me a second chance." As Brody rode out of town, Eli watched him go, his eyes filled with tears. He knew that he would never forget the sheriff, the man who had saved his life and given him a chance to redeem himself. And as he turned back to the sick child, he knew that he had finally found his place in the world. He had finally found his redemption, and he would never let it go.